Hello and welcome to week number 2 of social media communication, where we're specifically concentrating this week on two core areas: users and audiences within social media platforms, along with the concept of user created content (UCC), which is emerging from user generated content. Before we get going on that, though, I just want to do a few housekeeping issues. Firstly, on how to actually make your way through this lecture. So you'll note that you would have accessed this via our WordPress blog, which then has led you to this Storify page. I've used Storify purely because it's a nicer interface when we're introducing a whole lot of different types of texts and interactive materials. So that's why you're accessing this through Storify. But predominantly, I want to use this because it's a great way to incorporate case studies, examples, activities, and video that you're obviously watching right now. So what I've done is try to, we've started with the Scott McIntyre case study at the top. That's a good way to introduce the key themes of this week around social media users and how they're being, organisational staff, employees who are using social media platforms to communicate. It's this perfect mash between a private and a professional entity, and how those two have not gelled so well for Scott McIntyre in this last week. But we can discuss this further in our Google Hangouts with each of you in the coming couple of days. So in each instance, just scroll through the Storify sections. I'll introduce core themes with videos and then invite you to undertake activities. In total, the lecture should take you about 40 minutes to work through. At the end of it, I'd like you to go back to our WordPress blog and write a comment there. The final activity is looking at one of the newer social media platforms called Ello, and I'd like you to make a few observations on how you construct your personal identity in that space. The second piece of housekeeping before we get going into the lecture proper is just a brief overview of assignment number 2. I realise that I may have been a little brash in how I've been describing some of the activities, i.e. designing logos, given that some of you aren't familiar or coming from a background of media and communications. In all instances, there are a great amount of online resources that can help you to perform some of these tasks. So if you are feeling a little anxious around some of the things in terms of, getting a platform designed or whatever, please do contact me, and I can either step you through the process myself and or direct you to online resources which can help you in something like how to design a logo or how to shoot a video or whatever it might be. So please, do ask if you have issues. Okay, so getting on with this week's content. Predominantly in this first video, I'll be looking at the concept of online users within social media spaces, referencing heavily our text, the Sam Hinton and Larissa Horth Understanding Media, Chapter 3, Social Network Sites, as it's a really useful way to work our way through who people are, our users, audiences, prod users, as we'll start to talk about them in the second half of today's lecture. So I think in the first instance, it's useful to think about social networking sites as a useful way to approach it. And I direct your attention to page 34, where they're talking about the Boyd and Allison quote, which I think sums up social networking sites beautifully. They say, web-based services that allow individuals to, social networking sites are web-based services that allow individuals to, 1, construct a public or semi-public profile within a bounded system, 2, articulate a list of other users with whom they share a connection, And 3, view a traverse and traverse their list of connections and those made by others within the system. 2007. So a useful way to think about this in terms of how these platforms manifest themselves and how individuals are attracted to them to perform certain tasks. It's interesting to note that in a lot of instances, people are coming to these spaces to also reflect on their offline relationships. So we started to talk about online and offline and the connecting or the melding or merging of the two spaces and how we represent ourselves in these types of spaces. Social networking sites being the platform that enable users to come and be mobilized through social media applications. So that's one way to think about it. It's also a way to mediate relationships and understand how online relationships develop over time. So if we historically go back through social networking sites and the formations of how they've emerged, we could go back to really old school spaces like Usenet and bulletin board services. But I think in terms of academic in terms of scholarship, a significant player was Howard Rheingold and his research and observations that he did in the electronic group of users called the Well. And he's written a great book which Sam and Larissa acknowledge in their book, Homesteading on the Electronic Frontier, and that's where he started to talk about these things called virtual communities. And one of the core aspects to think about here is this, the tension that's present between users who are perhaps in a basement on a computer interacting in virtual communities and how they're essentially alone, but they are in these masses of users who are together and interacting and being quite social in that regard. So one of the big things that has always emerged within this concept of virtual communities is how people are alone, yet they're together, alone together. There's been some good work done in this space, and we'll come back to some of that in a moment. One thing I will point your direction to, or your attention to here, is Sherry Turkle and how she dovetails into this discussion around virtual communities as a way of forming new identities. So users coming to platforms or social media spaces in that kind of context, constructing identities and performing out new forms of identity. Moving along from virtual communities, another category or a way to think about it is network communities, and Barry Wellman's documented as one of the leading authors in this space, where he says that people communicate more in network communities, but it really is dependent on the strength of their offline relationships, and this starts to really strengthen this argument around the concept of online environments that are created through real-world ties. For example, and I think Hinton and Horth use this in terms of the social capital discussion that they have further on, where people from a similar small country town have a bond or a connection before they're even in the online environment, and so they bring those ties and connections with them. So there's some sort of there's a real world tie between the users who are interacting in this space, and this is where these sorts of ties influence community formations, and we start to see the emergence of network communities. This starts to shift where we move away from this concept of communities towards more of the network publics. And if we think about a definition of publics, you could note this as groups of users under a common set of principles. So groups of individuals coming together to operate in specific formations. However, interactions in these spaces are kind of unmotivated because people don't actually know each other. It's people who are connected through a theme or a purpose. However, they don't really know each other, so the motivation to interact with others in that space is not really there. But what does happen is that users, through networked individualism, begin to act in particular ways that seek the attention of others. And a way to think about this is an attention economy. So in the way that I perform my online space or my online activities, this attracts certain users. I develop relationships. I build a social construct around this. My social capital increases in these spaces, and these are kind of some of the fundamental concepts to think about with network publics. Which then I guess leads us to this question around networks or communities. Is it better to be part of a network, a connected network, or an online community? Networked publics versus online communities. And this is where we can draw on sociology, especially Tony's and his work around Gemeinschaft or Gesellschaft, where I think a useful way to think about these concepts is Gemeinschaft is more of the small, local, village type of approach where users or where people living in that space have lots of connections, they have lots of things in common, beyond just the geography of where they're located. There's a common interest amongst those people, whereas the larger Gesellschaft concept is more society, which could be aligned with the concept of a big city where there's lots of people who are geographically connected and lots of little pockets of connectivity around certain aspects in that space. So I guess it depends on why it is that we're there, and how we interact in that space, which again comes back to this argument of social capital. So how we do certain things, which then impacts, that becomes a type of economy or a capital measurement in terms of how we relate to certain things through taste. Hinton and Hawth go through to explain this from the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu and his work around taste agents. And this is an interesting concept to think about in terms of how users construct, continually negotiate, and evolve and reshape their social networks. We then move towards this concept of intimate publics, and I think this is quite crucial in more contemporary times where publics come together temporarily. Twitter is a really great example of this around a hashtag conversation. If we take let's use the Scott McIntyre hashtag or conversation that's been emerging over the last few days. He's a group of disparate people who are coming together around a common conversation theme or topic. Many of these users do not know each other, have no previous interaction, potentially, who have come together around a particular theme or topic and who are now engaging in conversation around that. As this social environment evolves and develops, users will interact with each other, norms will be constructed, conversations will emerge and evolve. And again, we come back to this concept of social capital, where those who display authoritative types of approaches or knowledge or expertise in specific areas, their input is essentially valued more than others. So this is where we start to see the downfall of having large follower bases. So, for example, if a Twitter user has 10,000 followers, it really doesn't matter in this type of context. What does matter is their input and their significance in the conversation around that particular theme. This leads to a form of cultural intimacy, which can be defined as a common understanding of a particular phenomenon. For example, the same country town, going back to the same example that Hinton and Hawth used before. Finally, it's worth knowing around the trends, the emerging trends around social network sites, and of course, it was initially conceived that social networking sites are for young people in Western countries, which is, of course, has been debunked in recent times, where non-Anglo users are adopting social network sites at an amazing rate for all sorts of purposes, and also the age and the demographic is changing and shifting dramatically. What was initially thought to be the platform for young users is not so much the case. We're also seeing the mobilisation of political groups, for example, things like Occupy Wall Street. Social networking sites are at the centre of these sorts of organisations. Additionally, the shift in privacy landscapes, context that we were exploring in last week's lecture, and a booming area in this space is as social networking sites provide application programming interfaces, APIs, which is sort of like a backdoor into the software. This enables or promotes this burgeoning data analytics field, which is where a lot of business is being generated at the moment. And a lot of great research is being conducted in this form. So down below, there's a series of examples that I'd like you to go and now have a look at and think about as you go through each one of these online spaces, for example, Wikipedia, Reddit, and Twitter hashtag conversations, for example. I want you to think about whether these are specifically online communities, networked publics, intimate publics, what type of grouping these people are and why. What's the characteristics of them? How do they interact? What sort of languages are used? What are the norms that they're constructing? How are they evolving over time? And just have a bit of a think around that, and then come back to this space and we'll continue with the second part of the lecture, which is looking at user-created content.